Right, are we streaming now? Do I start?
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Mothering at the Edinburgh Anarchist Feminist Book Fair 2021. If you're joining us for the first time, please take a moment to look over our Safer Spaces agreement, which is available to read on our website. I'll post a link into the chat just after this introduction. On the website, you can also check out the book fair stalls and the full program for the weekend. As ever, the book fair is made possible by people giving their time and labor. All donations we take will go directly to the speakers and organizations taking part. So if you can, please consider donating via our PayPal. Again, I'll drop a link into the chat. We're always keen to hear feedback about how we can improve the book fair next year and make our programming and our spaces more accessible. If you have any thoughts that you'd like to draft to the event, please drop a line via the feedback page on the website. And please also be aware that this event is being recorded by YouTube. Any comments that you put in the chat will be visible through that. I'll be feeding comments from the chat to the speakers for the duration of the talk. There'll be about a 10-minute Q&A at the end of it. So thank you for coming, everyone. And I will now, I'll now hand over to Mai'a Williams. Thanks.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm coming to you from unceded Anishinaabe and Lakota territory, also known as Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm going to start off. I wrote a few books, but I wrote a book called This Is How We Survive, Revolutionary Mothering, Love, and Exile in the 21st Century. And the talk today will be about revolutionary mothering and other fun topics. After I give this reading, I think I might have to give a slight intro into the work that I've done for the past 2 decades. That makes sense as to why I'm here. But I'll start off by talking about mothering first. So this is from the introduction. This is how we survive. And I'm under the section called We Are Not the Ones Destroying the Earth. So what I say is that marginalized mothers, poor mothers, queer mothers, single mothers, Black and brown mothers, Native mothers, teen mothers, etc. We mamas are the ones who are often blamed by mainstream discourse for the economic destruction and ecological degradation that is happening to this planet and human communities. We are blamed for the very collapse of societies globally, and we are not the ones destroying the earth. For many of us, the end of the world happened a long time ago. For many Native folks in the Americas, the end of the world began 500 years ago. For the colonized folks on the African continent, the end of the world, the nearly wholesale ecological and economic destruction is taking place. No need for the future tense when the apocalypse has already happened to us. And yet, the end of rapacious and murderous Western civilization, the global North, is blamed on mothers. Poor mothers are depicted as welfare queens living off the teat of the government and hardworking taxpayers. Queer mothers and single mothers are destroying the very foundation of the nuclear family. Black mothers can only reproduce criminality. Immigrant mothers are just producing anchor babies and are destroying the very concept of what nationhood and nation state mean. First, I want to say good on these mothers for doing the work of destroying oppressive structures such as nation statehood, the nuclear heteronormative family, and for redistributing money and resources from the wealthy and the government coffers back to the poor, indigenous, and colonized, so that these folks have the opportunity to create more liberated and egalitarian community structures. And second, and more importantly, marginalized mothers are not destroying the fabrics that support us as whole human beings. We are not the ones destroying the earth. We are not the ones creating civil wars that kill millions of people and create droughts and famines in East Africa. We are not the reasons that there are refugee crises happening in Syria, Yemen, and South Sudan. We did not cause the global recession in 2008. No, that was caused by big banks too big to fail and decades of economic policies that allowed for speculative finance to run wild. We are not the reason that there still isn't clean water in Flint, Michigan. We aren't the reason a massive chunk of an iceberg, nearly the size of the state of Delaware, broke off Antarctica's Larsen ice shelf. We did not cause global warming and climate instability. We are not the ones destroying the earth. We are the liberatory resistance communities that are humanity's best chance for humans and non-humans to survive into the next century. Okay, that's my short reading on this Sunday evening. So how should I do this next? I think I'll talk just for a couple of seconds, just to give a brief intro into the work that I've done really quickly, and then I'll hand it over to Helen. So basically the work that I've done from starting in 2003 up until this moment has basically been supporting resistance communities globally. So I worked in Palestine in 2003 and 2004, and then again in 2006. I worked in East Africa doing research on the war and the effects of the war against Congolese women in 2006 in East Congo. And then I was in the Zapatista communities in Chiapas, Mexico in 2007 and 2008 with my baby daughter, who she was born to me in 2007. And then in 2009, she and I spent 3 days in Israeli detention during the Israeli bombing of Gaza. And then we lived in Egypt from 2009 until 2013, before, during, and after the Arab Spring. After that, we worked with refugee communities in Berlin, Germany in 2013, and then again, and then we were at Standing Rock, North Dakota for the No DAPL campaign in 2016, working with the midwives and medics. And then we were again in Berlin working with the refugee communities in 2000, and I'm trying to get the timeline correct, excuse me, 2017, 18, and 19, where I was basically living until I came back to the US for a few months when COVID happened. And then that's how I end up here in Minnesota once again. And last year we were doing mutual aid work and support work, and I was training street medics because I'm a midwife and a street medic as well, during the uprising that happened last year in 2020 in Minneapolis. And so I'm currently in Minneapolis doing mutual aid work and support work for the communities here who are continuing to fight against police repression and to fight for abolition of police and prisons. So that's my really quick bio, and I'm going to hand it off to Helen.
Thank you so much, Mai'a. I mean, hearing that bio in such a rapid succession is like dotting across like community to community. And yeah, thanks so much for being here and talking to me about your work and your book. First, I wanted to ask you to talk about revolutionary motherhood as a phrase, right? Revolutionary mothering as kind of like the guiding idea behind so much of what you do, right? It seems to me like it's something that links everything together, all kinds of resistance work, and you write about that. And I wondered if you could talk about kind of that phrase's origins almost for you. And I know it was a zine, right, initially, and then there's this edited collection, which is amazing, full of incredible voices that you edited, and then your memoir, obviously. So was the zine the kind of first place that phrase came together for you?
Okay, so first I'm going to do the little book plug, right, of course. So, because it's a book fair, so I get to do that for a second. Revolutionary Mothering, the anthology. Okay, it was published in 2016. No, actually, the phrase revolutionary motherhood actually came out of community. So my daughter was born on April 19th, 2007. And then 6 months later, basically as soon as I could travel with my kid, let's be honest, we did a road trip from Minneapolis down to Mexico. And along the way, we stopped at a conference for women of color against violence I just forgot this, in Colorado, thank goodness, in Colorado, where I sat in one of the last sort of sessions at the conference, which was called Revolutionary Motherhood, and was organized by 2 or 3 indigenous and women of color organizations who were doing support work for like poor and indigenous and mothers of color. And I just sat in this room full of like mothers and their children, and it was utterly amazing, and it was so illuminating. And basically it was what I consider to be like a deep hang moment. And that was the phrase where I first heard the phrase revolutionary motherhood. So a few months later, I then went to the Zapatista Women's Encuentro in Chiapas, Mexico, where some of those same people came down to do support work. And then inspired by both that conference time and the time I'd spent with the Women's Zapatista Encuentro, as well as obviously the work I'd done with Palestinian mothers and Congolese mothers, I decided I wanted to do this zine called Revolutionary Motherhood. And I did it like in collaboration with the people, with the communities who I'd first heard it from. So those first, and they're also represented in this book as well. And so that started it off. I did a zine first, and then I started a blog, like a group blog, to get more people. This is back in 2008, when blogs were still things that you did, you know? And so we did a group blog, and then I was in Egypt in 2009 when Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Dr. Alexis Pauline Gumbs now, hit me up, and we were just chatting back and forth over email, and she was like, we should do a book on revolutionary motherhood. She had just finished doing her doctorate, which really paralleled a lot of that work. So she had been doing her research and archival work. I had been doing my sort of like on the ground field activism work. And so we got together in 2009. China Martins came in around 2010, and she had China Martins, who had done one of the first like sort of radical mothering zines. I think the first one that we know of to have existed. You know, she's about maybe 11, 12 years older than I am, and she was a teenage mom. And so we got together, and then we worked for the next 5 years to bring the anthology to fruition. And we did it through, literally, I remember the Arab Spring was happening. I was living on Tahrir, which was like the main organizing space for it. I didn't mean to do that. I just happened to wake up one day and it was there. And I remember going out to like protest and then coming back and printing out all of these like submissions that had been done and like trying to figure out which submissions were which. And then I was going back out to the streets, and then I was putting my kid to sleep, and like, this was the work. So it really was organic in that way, like doing revolutionary work while mothering, while trying to get this anthology going. So that anthology came out in 2016 then. It took 7 years from the seed and to its fruition, let's say. Yeah. So that's how it came about. And one other thing I want to talk about was sure to mention, which is that we originally had the conception of like revolutionary motherhood. And I want to give credit, because citation is always love, to Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who had been reading Hortense Spillers, I think, and had made, and I think it's Spillers, and I feel bad for getting this wrong if I got it wrong, who made a distinction between motherhood and mothering, and said that motherhood is the institution that some people are allowed to enter, primarily like white upper class women, who are allowed to enter into motherhood as an institution that protects them against certain degradations. And that the rest of us are actually, when we do mothering, when we do caretaking work, we aren't protected by those institutions. And so she made that distinction between the institution and the practice itself of doing mothering. So that's where we changed it from revolutionary to revolutionary mothering. So that's the story.
Yeah, and it's such a key distinction, as you say, like this, the institution of motherhood is in many ways extremely conservative, right, and weaponized against marginalized communities in almost every sense, right, in every country in a particular way, a different way. The innocence or the kind of, you know, yeah, which I think, I mean, Black feminist writers we're always at the forefront, I think, of that, making those distinctions and definitions, right? Like everything I read in my own work now, it's like Hortense Spillers is like one of the key like hearts, beating hearts at the center of the study of mothering and of maternity, right? And so much in your work, which I find so fascinating, and also I think is something that isn't necessarily really always acknowledged that much, is carving out a space for mothering in radical spaces can be really, really hard, right? Because it's domestic labor, it's care work, and it's often not accommodated in practical ways. And it seems like in what you're doing, it's highlighting the distinction between reproductive rights and reproductive justice, right? You know, everyone has the right to mother if they want to, and that should be possible in radical spaces and left-wing spaces, right? And throughout, particularly, this is how we survive, childcare and the lack of provision of childcare and the lack of thought about it is present in every single space that you move through. The Zapatista communities, the West Bank, everywhere. And I wonder if that, I mean, if that still happens. I'm guessing the answer is yes, but how central that is, that the blind spot, I guess, about childcare in those communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so it's an interesting thing to me, right? Like it's a very interesting dichotomy because, so my daughter right now is 14 years old, all right? So in some ways, I don't need childcare in the same way I did 7 years ago. I need some kind of support, but it's not that kind of, there's a difference between having a toddler and a teenager. In some ways there is not. In some ways there definitely is. But yeah, one of the things I found really interesting about the childcare issue, which is what I sort of brought up over and over again, is, you know, because I raised my daughter until she was 8 years old outside of the, I mean, we did some time in Berlin, but outside of that, mainly in like Egypt and then in South America. And when we worked in communities that were predominantly when we worked in communities that didn't include a lot of Westerners, this is just to be perfectly blunt, childcare was a much easier issue. It was a much, much easier issue because everyone has children. Like the idea that I would participate in something and I would be in my 30s at that point and I wouldn't have a child to them would have been like really, the fact that I only had one child was what kind of got them. They're like, only one? Like, yeah, one, okay? Like, get off of me. But, and those people grow up in relatively large families, to be honest, with children, if you live in, you know, where you just see children everywhere. So there wasn't the same distinction between what is child space and what is adult space, and that these two have to be separate, and that if there is a child space, it has to be constructed in these very perfect ways so the child is constantly, I don't know how to put it, like, so the child never has to deal with anything a little bit or uncertain or a little bit insecure. It was assumed that I would bring my child with me to meetings. It was assumed I would bring my child with me into spaces. It was assumed that everybody, I mean, I always kept an eye on her, obviously, but that people would take her off, you know, and feed her and take care of her, and then someone else would bring her back to me. When I worked in the Zapatista communities, I literally would have to go look for my kids sometimes because I'd be like, where is, but I worked in those spaces, in those countries, and I was working frankly, around Westerners. I don't want to use these, I'm not sure to use these distinctions like Norte Americanos or Europeans, and you know what I'm trying to say here. Yeah. Northern, suddenly there would not be childcare. And it would become so clear to go from one organizing space to another on the same street, one of which was organized primarily by Westerners, one, even if we were in Egypt, the other one being primarily organized by, and so when I think about radical spaces, I'm usually talking about these sort of Western radical spaces where it's assumed that I have, as I used to say to them, do you think I have a wife? Do you assume because I don't, to sort of just whisk her off into the netherworld and then she'll reappear, you know? So that was definitely one of those sort of So the same thing happened. For instance, I'll give the example of the Zapatista Encuentro. So in the Zapatista Encuentro, it was supposed to be the Westerners who organized the childcare space in that area. And of course, it's the one thing that they fall through with. And so we arrive and the Westerners haven't organized their space. And I'm like, okay, fine, you know? And so I have her with me those days. The difference between working, let's say, with the Zapatista Encuentro and then working what would have been a similar space that was predominantly Westerners is that the fact that I had a child with me did not throw people off, even if certain people had not done their due diligence. When I'm working in, let's say, in Germany or in the US, the fact that I would have a child with me would throw people off. And I would be unwelcome, like there would be no space even made for me to do the work that I need to do while I have her. So I think in some ways I try to tell people, like, because there's community care in a lot of parts of the world outside of where I just mentioned, in some ways it's easier to do radical work or to do activism work because you're not required to get rid of the mothering aspect. And so that's the first part of it, which is just about childcare. So I just want to like bridge it out for half a second to say, and I think that gets reflected in the way that spaces are organized generally, because I noticed, for instance, I'll go back, I know I'm kind of skipping over countries, but you can see why this might happen. When I was working with the Egyptian revolutionaries, in the beginning of that revolution, care work was very central to the way those spaces were organized. And in a lot of different aspects, not just with childcare, but also with folks who were disabled, also making sure that women were protected, also making all of these ways in which people who were seen as vulnerable were given space for protection. And as the revolution moved on, you could see the sort of like individualistic machismo attitudes kind of seeping into the movement more and more people being pushed out of the space, out of Tahrir, out of the sort of occupation of Tahrir. And you started to see the devolution of sort of the revolutionary ideals that happen. And the two things seem to happen very concurrently. So I think some ways I point towards childcare because it's sort of like a canary in the mine, right? Like in the spaces where you don't even think, and please keep in mind, it is the youth who organize almost all these spaces initially. It is the youth who first did the Arab Revolution. It is the youth who first started who were on the front lines of the Zapatista movement. It is the youth who were first organized Standing Rock. Standing Rock is first organized by teenagers. So the idea that you would want to push children out of organizing spaces is really pushing out the impetus that started the organizing in the first place, right? So that's my little soapbox speech about.
I mean, it's so useful to the state power structures, the general kind of just power in society, right? To enforce the distinction between political life and life care work and domestic life and those things, right? Like that's a classic tactic of stopping people from actually forging meaningful bonds or communities strengthening, people being recompensed for their work, whatever it is. It's a tactic, right? It's on purpose that those things happen. And so much, I guess, in This Is How We Survive, you kind of remind your reader that like revolution isn't just a word. Like it's a goal, and it's also something to try and kind of live by in every single interpersonal relation, right? And care and the ways in which we kind of interrelate is fundamental to that, because if you don't think about that, then nothing's gonna happen. Like people are gonna be sick and people are gonna be left behind, and and I really loved this moment where you write about the idea that by voting with our dollars, is going to be enough. Like just by deciding to boycott something alone is going to be enough. For example, you know, boycotting Sabra hummus is enough to just sort everything out. You know, obviously it's important. It's something that needs to be like combined with other things. And you use that analysis and kind of interrelate it with Silvia Federici so much, right? Like it's such a central part of your thinking, this subsistence work of care and of mothering. And I wondered how much of mothering specifically is about resisting the commodification of human relationships, the idea that you look after someone and then that's a kind of debt, a debtor-creditor relationship, or there's a kind of transaction that happens in every kind of moment of care. I wondered if that was central to what you're saying.
Very much so. Like I think what mothering and care work, I think the reason it trips people up so often, and is because it's not a transactional care. It's not a transactional type of relationship. I think that, so it's not just that. I don't think that it's just that, you know, childcare is just sidelined. I think it's that, you know, there's a fetishization of sort of this, of the hero in revolutionary and radical work of activism, right? So, and that hero, we know what that person looks like. And first say he, because we know they're white and they're able-bodied and they're independent and they are invulnerable to everything, right? And they're cis and they're het, and you know, they have the fullness of this. And that is sort of and we make our heroes the people who fit closest to that ideal. You know, maybe they're not white this time, you know, or maybe they're not male this time, but they get as close as we can get them to this ideal, because in some ways, and I think so, because they're not vulnerable. They're the least vulnerable people in our society. And we assume that the people who are least vulnerable are the people who are able to do the most and can contribute the most. And I just flatly disagree. And I feel like everything in my life has told me that that's not true. So I experienced that tension a lot between me saying, wait, what? Because for a couple of reasons. One of which is that hero person, that machismo aspect, is only able to do his work because everyone else is doing theirs. He's held up by this huge network of care, this huge, invisible to him maybe, network of care and relations and non-transactional relationships that have been built in order to allow for this person to sort of quote unquote rise to the top, right? There is somebody, as I say, there is somebody who is making the food, and there is somebody who is taking care of the children and taking care of the elderly. And there is somebody who is sitting down and gathering the wisdom so that they're able to feed it. There is somebody who is creating the community. There are somebodies, lots of somebodies who are doing that work. And those people are the people who I'm trying to sort of center in the work versus these sort of like one-offs that sort of pop up on our screen. And I think that for a lot of people, and I understand it, I get it, because there's so much representation for this one personality, this one aspect, people aim to be like that. And so you see a lot of sort of revolutionary movements, right? Especially when they start to feel under attack, when they start to get that counterattack coming back at them, what they start to do over and over and over again is to say, everybody who cannot take care of themselves, everybody who has a vulnerability needs to be pushed to the sidelines because you're dangerous to the actual revolution. When in reality, these are the people who made it in the first place. So, and so that's what I'm sort of pushing back against, that like we can't create revolutionary movements that are based on transactional relationships. That's just not going to work. That's bringing in the ideologies of neoliberalism and capitalism and all of that, of heteropatriarchy and all of that back into our movements and then wondering why they fall apart. It's like, because those ideologies aren't going to support the world that we're trying to create. So we have to find something else. And the something else that I kind of lean towards is, have we tried, hear me out for a second, We tried taking care of each other instead. I don't know, it might actually be closer to the thing that we're actually aiming for. Like, have we actually tried centering care work? And I want to just really quickly, I know I'm rambling a little bit, but I just want to bring in just for a second, because citation is love, Alea Lakshmi, I can never pronounce their last name, who does, because it's Portuguese, or Portuguese colon, care work. That book, which does the work of a disability justice. I think that a lot of the work that's in that, I feel like they're coming from a slightly different perspective, but they're doing really similar push against this idea. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm trying to mediate. I'm trying to ask us to do work that's non-transactional, and I'm saying that if we don't do that, and I'll end it with this by saying that the way I put it is, and the way that I've now organized my life is that if mothering and care work, and by mothering, I don't just obviously mean, we'll get to that, but I don't just mean women biologically giving birth to children. But if mothering, the work of caring and care work, is not central to the work that a movement or an organization or a collective is doing, it's not going to be successful. So I see no reason to participate in it. And I just don't. And I have found that this has made my life much easier.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that the pandemic, again, not to fall into that trap of being like, everything's changed, because that, it hasn't changed. It's just made more obvious and clarified more like the state of things and how isolated people are and how vulnerable people are. It's been interesting and enraging to see kind of the discourse, but like in the UK, which is like very, very kind of dire political straits at the minute, but like this narrative that gets pushed that is just kind of discarding vulnerable people, or people that the current structure of society decrees to be vulnerable, because they can't participate for whatever reason as full economic subjects in which is the way that you get valued. That's how you kind of survive currently. That at the very beginning of the pandemic, I remember there being more, I guess, people were speaking as if there was more possibility, as if this was going to change everything. Finally the scales were going to fall from people's eyes, and they would realize that actually, they needed to look out for their neighbors and blah, blah, blah. And actually it doesn't really seem like that, like that's happening for various reasons. I'm rambling now, sorry. I'm just kind of, the despair is like come into my...
No, I think that's really crucial, because I mean, one of the things I've been saying as well, because people have been like, give us a definition of revolutionary mothering. And I'm always like, okay, I have various ones because people have given them to me. One of them was, it's communism without the baggage, which I thought was funny. A friend of mine who's a prison abolitionist, that's what she calls it. I was like, well, I've been referring to mutual aid before, it became, I mean, it was interesting to see. But that was the closest thing I could come to revolutionary mothering in a communal sense, was like, have you tried mutual aid? Because that is much closer to the work that I think is critical. And I thought it was, and I just want to say for a second, it was amazing to watch, watch this maybe globally, this pandemic happen, because it was like watching an entire, because I lived under state violence and state closures, and times when you can't leave your house for days on end, and so on and so forth, and you don't know what's going to happen next. And the stores have all been like raided of random things. I don't know why everyone needed toilet paper all of a sudden, but I had lived through that multiple times. So I was like, okay, we can do this. This we can handle. And then to see the next thing happen, which is everyone starts to do mutual aid work. And everyone's like, oh my goodness, what if this is, what if the economic structures aren't going to support me in the interim? What will I do? I should know, we should be making sure that everyone in the community is taken care of. And then watching that, it was like watching globally the same structures of care work coming together and falling apart that I had seen happening in these smaller instances, like it was like, oh, look at the theory come real like and now we have, of course, like things like which countries get vaccines first and how people are hoarding the vaccines and so on and so forth. And it's just seeing it replicate itself over and over and over again, where once again, I can say, we'll call it mutual aid now, but like revolutionary mothering is the key, or the thing that is actually going to allow for people to be able to take care of each other. And then we sort of abandon that at a certain point in order to get to these sort of machismo, the people who are closest to this ideal, this capitalist militaristic ideal of who gets to survive and who doesn't. And if you can't take care of yourself, then just stay in the house, just don't leave your house ever again. That's what we plan to do now. Which is so it's just interesting to see how, once again, a society in crisis goes through these stages. And yeah, it's the next book anyways. So when you said that, I was like, I'm working on it.
Well, I was just thinking about, I guess as you were speaking there, like your mutual aid and revolutionary mothering as kind of related practices or different ways of saying the same thing makes so much sense. And I don't know if you saw, but a few weeks ago in Glasgow, there was a successful kind of community action that stopped an immigration raid, which was great. It was amazing, but there's networks, there's tenants unions, there's a no evictions network, years and years and years of people who've been putting in so much time kind of building that in the community. Also mutual aid groups in the pandemic, people really getting to know their neighbors and where they live. And also lots of people were working from home, or they weren't, out at an office all day, so they could kind of turn up and show up for their neighbors, and all these things kind of interlink, right? The only way that you can actually stop the things happening or kind of, resist is if you have time, and if you have kind of connections and a community where there are people who kind of pool their skills and protect each other, right? Rather than being kind of one big I am who's kind of, I don't know, whatever.
I just want to say one more thing to that, because that was the same thing that happened in Minneapolis last year in we're at the 1 year anniversary. I think the police precinct burnt down 2 days ago, a year and 2 days ago. But the reason that was so successful in a city that frankly only has about 20, it's a white predominant city. It's not New York, it's not Atlanta. We have cities that are very heavily of color and Black and have a long organizing history. That's not where this started. It started in Minneapolis, which even I was surprised about. But the reason was because people were home and people were working from home, and people had already built out these networks of mutual aid for 3 months before it started, and people knew their neighbors better. So when it started, there were already all of these tracks and pathways to get things done. And it made it so that rather than before, there have been other uprisings, much smaller organizings against police violence and police murder here. But the reason that this one was able to push it towards getting the city council to kind of vote to defund the police, it's a long story, was because they didn't have to do all of that work initially. A lot of that mutual aid work had already been done. So when you came and hit the streets, there were already multiple layers ready to do that work. So yeah, just would say that it's a similar thing, yeah.
Yeah, and existing relationships, right? Or just it's easier to care if you have time.
Yeah.
Just again, another like great trick of capitalism is that you don't have any, so you can't do anything. I want to come back to what you said a few tangents ago now, about mothering not being gendered, because that's so key, right? And again, in the UK, there's this kind of massive kind of regression in terms of sexual politics and gender politics. There's this kind of incredibly transphobic media. There's this kind of weaponization of biology as being this kind of destiny, or this kind of, whatever. And I feel like when I read the way that mothers are kind of spoken of and written about in kind of the mainstream press, it is this really specific definition of mothering and womanhood are synonymous. And they give value to each other in this way that's terrifying.
Yeah. So that's one of the, I feel like one of the crucial parts of what I say is that, so let's start with the Alice Walker quote, which I always butcher. I don't know why I do this. I've been talking, in which she says something close to, mothering is an instinct, but it's also a practice. It can be learned. And I go one point and say mothering is a practice and it should be learned. That everyone is responsible for the work of mothering. Now, there are some people definitely who have been socially trained to do the work of caretaking. And those, like I am one of those people. And a lot of them are girls and women, right? But that is a socially trained mechanism. It is the act of, I define mothering, and we define mothering this way of like, of caring for and affirming and sustaining life, right? That is the work that anybody can do. That is not a biological precept. That does not require, excuse me to be so essentialistic about it, but a uterus to accomplish. Some of the best motherings I've known, people who've done mothering the best for me do not identify as women. And that's simply how it is. Some of the people who've done the best mothering or seen the best mothering practice are people who are in their 80s and 90s, who cannot biologically reproduce in any capacity. And so that's the first thing I want to make very clear is that like the act and work of doing care work is not, yes, the state it is definitely within. And that's why I want to ask questions of people who do radical politics. Why do we accept the definitions and the paradigms of the state and how we want to organize our own societies? Like, why would we want to do that in any real way, And if we look at, I dislike the romanticization of cultures outside the West because we can have that conversation. And it's to be said, we need to pay attention to the fact that societies and communities are organized differently than the ways that we have done so here. We have a highly individualistic, nuclear family-centric idea of what mothering looks like. We don't just think of it as sustaining and affirming life. We assume that it means that, to be honest, a woman is relatively isolated in her home, taking care of her biological children, doing housework. Housework is not necessarily mothering. My house can be a mess. Those are two different, they intertwine, but then I just want to make that very clear as well. Who is economically dependent upon, you know what I mean? Like we have this very, and if you think about it, it's a very strict construction of what the affirmation of life is, and this is where Sylvia Federici for me comes in order to reproduce workers for the state, right? That is why we have created the nuclear family. That is why we broke up the commons, and breaking up the commons wasn't just a land thing. It was also breaking up the common work of doing, sustaining and affirming life, in which again, I'm not trying to romanticize anything. I have no romantic bone left in my body at this point. But I do want to state that it seems pretty clear that before we move into sort of capitalism, industrialized capitalism, we also see that gender relations are much more equitable. Not perfect, more. So especially among those who count as the peasantry in Western Europe. So again, not perfect. Because I always feel like someone wants to come back at me and be like, but I'm like, yeah, I know. Okay. I know. And I want to point out one other thing, which is, so I'm going to go back to Black communities here in the US, right? Black communities here in the US, for the most part, have not had access to a lot of the protections of the state. And because of that, we haven't organized our communities to a large extent. That assumes that we have access to motherhood and to the protections of the state. So when you look at Black families and Black communities, my mother comes from Jim Crow South Carolina, grew up in, that's where our people come from. When we have about 100 acres of land there in which we just have, it's like a clan, we're just people. I think people in Edinburgh might understand. We're a clan of folk who live on this large piece of land. And because we didn't have police and we didn't have state protections and we had to create our own sense of how we were going to organize ourselves, I will say that gender relations to a large extent are really different. They're really different in Indigenous communities to a certain extent. They're really different in Indigenous Black communities to a certain extent. And the state, this is my last bit of it, because we're talking about US for a bit. The US state has pathologized those relations that don't look like the nuclear family and have claimed that, all of the issues in the Black community are not because we don't have access to resources, but are because we allow for women to lead the households. Okay. Sure. Anyways, so, where there aren't enough men in the households to be able to create stable families, when in reality, obviously, it's really incredible that Black folks were able to survive under apartheid in the South, and were able to do so because they did so because they allowed for mothering to be not perfect again, not romanticized, but allowed for mothering to be more central in that work, allowed for the care of each other to be more central in that work. So I do think, just to say, all that is to say is that, when we talk about sort of mothering and it being gendered in this very specific prescriptive form, I want to be that is not most of the world. It doesn't function that way for most of us.
And it's so new. It even in those kind of European communities where that's where it is. It's like the Industrial Revolution. it's a millisecond ago. And kind of.
And I just want to say one other thing, which is that, I lived in Berlin for a while, and I lived in the lefty Kreuzberg, what I'm talking about, if y'all know who I'm talking about. And I knew a lot of mothers. And the thing that interests me is that the fact that they have so much state welfare, no shade, but they do have so much state welfare for mothers, all of a sudden, I don't see a lot of people coupling together in the same household all of a sudden. I have very few friends who are mothers who live with their partners. They could, but they don't economically have to. And so they automatically seem to choose not to. And so the second, you know what I'm saying? It's so new, and that because the second that you you have more options, people start making more different kinds of choices.
Yeah. So. And even, with teen motherhood, right? Where I was growing up, it was this huge thing. It was benefit fraud and what you're talking about, welfare leeches and all this kind of stuff, and the idea that being a teen mother was this uniquely terrible thing. And it's no, it went against the rules of how you were supposed to access those resources. That's what it is. It's anyway. I realized that we're supposed to be at the Q&A now.
Oh,
so
sorry.
No, I know. Time's going so quickly. But there's a question from Alm Okbey, who says, "Hi, Helen and Mai'a. Hi. Can you talk more about healthcare and especially how it overlaps with the medic work that you do in these organizing spaces?" And I mean, because you're a midwife, right? And there's a follow-up. Also, tell us about your experience of trying to work in different countries for reproductive healthcare provision. Did you feel you were plugging in gaps, doing things the state wouldn't do?
So the short answer to that is yes. There's a longer answer, which is that, okay, so let's talk about doing healthcare and medic work in these organizing spaces. So I basically trained first as a doula and then as a midwife, which made sense for me. I was pregnant and then had a young child, and there's no better time to learn about midwifery and doula than when you're pregnant. You are very invested in the information and it feels very relevant to everything that's happening to you. It's not like you're yes, trust me. So that's sort of I kind of tracked those two things together. And it was a good time because I wasn't working a lot because I had a young child, so I was able to study a lot more, and I was able to, and doulaing and then midwifery allowed for me to have a more flexible schedule because I worked in the homes for the most part. I worked in some hospitals, but I primarily worked and did home birth. When I moved to Egypt, so I just want to go really quickly through this, which is when I moved to Egypt, I started first doing assistant work with what are called, with what would be the equivalent of community midwives who work outside of the hospitals. These are older women who are usually trained from other women and who do women's healthcare, basically what we consider to be women's healthcare. And they do a lot of things. They're called dayas. And so I kind of hung out with them for a while, and then I kind of started doing it on my own. So I had like Western biology, and then apprenticeship under this different way. So that's what starts the question. So when I became a medic, when I started also doing medic work, I had a pretty decent basis in how to do basic healthcare, how to patch somebody up, how to tell, how to take a pulse, how to do fevers, how to know how to move someone from one place to the other without causing harm, so on and so forth. When I first started doing real medic work was during the Egyptian Revolution, that's why I'm trying to move really, which is to say that the Egyptian healthcare system is an atrocity. It's just an absolute atrocity. And a lot of the atrociousness, by the way, is not only the lack of obviously money to go into hospitals and so on and so forth, but it's because they are very dedicated to an old school Western paradigm about how healthcare happens that the West itself has moved out of, but because they colonized certain people at certain times, they're still trying to live up and live into these spaces. So it's interesting, it's almost like it's like going back and forth at the same time. So a lot of the work that I did was because people were afraid of going into the hospitals. You went to the hospital at the last minute and you didn't know what you were going to get, and so on and so forth. So that's the first thing. The second reason I started doing it is because we were doing medic care for people who, if they went to the hospital, would be put into jail. It was the Egyptian Revolution. People were being put into jail in droves. I mean, people were getting their legs broken. They were coming out of jail with like limbs broken, so on and so forth. And so a lot of the work was honestly being able to provide care for folks who could not do anything else. And there was a large, I'm not a doctor, so that's not my work, but my work as a medic is just to get them towards safe doctors or safe nurses or whomever who can do that work. So yeah, I was plugging into those gaps, but for very clear reasons that the gaps existed for very clear reasons.
And healthcare has to exist outside of the state, right? If some people are.
And the last thing I'll say about it is the reason I first got interested, of course, in alternative healthcare is because I live in the US. We don't have healthcare, y'all. I don't know how to explain it to people who don't live here. I know that people think they understand, but if I get sick tomorrow and I have to go to the hospital, I'm not calling an ambulance. I will call an Uber and I will have it take me, because an ambulance will cost me $2,000 and an Uber will cost me $10. That's why, I think those radical healthcare initiatives in the States, the reason you see so much of that is because we really don't have alternatives the way that, that's that.
Yeah. So there's another question from Actual Spinster, which is a great name. I wonder if you have time, and maybe this has to be the last question actually. I wonder if you have time, if you could talk a little bit more about safety/security, in quote marks, in terms of bringing up your daughter and bringing her with you into organizing spaces.
Okay, I can do this very quickly, hopefully. I'm this in 4 minutes, y'all. So if I speak quickly, I'm sorry. Because I come from the East Coast in the US, so we speak at 1.5 by nature. All right, yeah, I can talk. So here's the thing, right? I understand that in the West, and I know I keep saying in the West, I'm sorry, I don't have another designation to really get it yet. I understand that in the West, we have created part of our way of of controlling people who do care work is to tell them that their job is to make sure that nothing harmful ever happens to your child at any point, at any time, anywhere, anyhow. And if you do, you will be like, it's your fault. Okay. It doesn't matter if it was the police who did it. It doesn't matter if it was whoever, it was your fault, right? Because we have no sense of the idea of community care. We have no sense of the idea that the community itself should be able to take care of the child with you. We have no sense of the village kind of issue. It is the individualized, not even father, but mother's job to make sure that nothing bad ever happens to other human beings. Bullshit. I'm sorry, but bullshit. I'm sorry. That is a traumatic thing to tell to another human being. And I think it is psychologically impairing. And I think it's why the second that someone becomes a mother, they step completely out of any activism spaces because they can't handle the repercussions of what's going to happen if anything happens at any time, at any place, anywhere. When I worked in Palestine, I was working with children who were being attacked by Israeli settlers and as they were trying to walk their way to school every single day, and their parents would send them to school every day. And there was a lot of talk among the Westerners that I worked with, whether or not that was child abuse, as if the parents themselves were the ones doing the abuse and not the Israeli settlers who were throwing stones and rocks and calling Israeli military out to shoot these children was child abuse. Okay. In most movements that have existed in the world, children have been on the front lines. Now, really quickly, does that mean that I take my child out onto the front lines of a march or anything? No, it does not. But what it does definitely mean is that I get to have that question around how do I keep my child and myself as safe as possible without acting as if I am responsible for the actions of the police or the state military or whoever else deems that we are too vulnerable and thus we are allowed to be attacked. It is a difficult algorithm or algebra to figure out, but it's one that I think is much more responsible than it is to the idea that we should hide in our houses or hide in our country or hide in our safe gated communities, because without that, we are completely liable for whatever happens. I think that is victim blaming at the worst. And I reject the ideologies of the state. If something happens to me or my daughter when we are out in the streets, I am going to feel horrific because I love my kid more than anything in the world. But the idea that I am responsible because we were walking down the street and some police decided to shoot at us, that is completely and utterly my responsibility, is also horrific and psychological violence. And that's the balance that I keep. It's 1 o'clock.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mai'a.
Thank you, Helen.
I wish we could talk for like 2 more hours, but I realized that we can't, even though it's an anarchist festival. And thank you to everyone for your questions. And Molly, who's just disappeared, who is moderating, and Vicky, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, bye.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, we're still streaming.
Are we still streaming?
Oh, it still says live, so I don't know what to do.